August 25, 1944, that guns in Paris had barely fallen silent when the city exploded into celebration. Church bells rang across the Seine. Tricolor flags appeared from shuttered windows that had hidden them for 4 years. Crowds surged through the boulevards, pulling Allied soldiers from their vehicles, kissing them, lifting them onto shoulders. To the world, it looked like victory. But less than 200 miles to the east, German Army Group B was still intact. Its divisions were battered, yes, but not destroyed. They were falling back toward the German border, carrying with them tanks, artillery, and something far more dangerous, time, and in a forward command post outside the capital. 2 American generals were already arguing over what would happen next. Paris was free, but the war was far from over. The liberation of Paris had come sooner than many Allied planners expected. After the breakout from Normandy in Operation Cobra in late July 1944, American forces under Lieutenant General Omar Bradley had punched through the German lines near Saint-Clair. Once the front cracked, it did not simply bend, it collapsed. Patton's newly activated Third Army surged south and west, racing across Brittany. British and Canadian forces pressed from the north. German units attempted to withdraw through the narrowing Falaise pocket. The destruction there was catastrophic. Thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured. Equipment littered the roads. But crucially, not all escaped routes were sealed in time. Significant elements of the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army slipped east. They were wounded, not annihilated. Meanwhile, Paris simmered. The French resistance, sensing opportunity, rose in mid-August. Barricades went up. German patrols were ambushed. Railway lines were sabotaged. Adolf Hitler had already issued a direct order to the military governor of Paris, General Dietrich von Choltitz. The city was to be destroyed if it could not be held. Bridges mined, monuments rigged, but von Choltitz hesitated. His garrison was isolated, short on supplies, and surrounded by a city no longer willing to obey. When General Philippe Leclerc's 2nd French Armored Division reached the outskirts on August 24th, the outcome became inevitable. By August 25th, German forces in Paris surrendered. General Charles de Gaulle marched down the Champs-Élysées the following day, projecting defiance, sovereignty, and continuity. The symbolism was immense. Newsreels flashed across London, Washington, and Moscow. Paris had fallen in 1940. Now it stood free. For civilians, it felt like the war was ending. For the Allied High Command, it was only entering its most dangerous phase. On paper, the situation looked favorable. German forces in France were east toward the Seine and beyond. Allied air superiority was overwhelming. The Wehrmacht's armored formations were depleted. Fuel shortages were crippling German mobility. Yet Allied supply lines were strained to the breaking point. Every gallon of fuel, every artillery shell, every ration had to move from the Normandy beaches across wrecked French infrastructure. The artificial Mulberry harbors were under pressure. Cherbourg's port facilities had been sabotaged. Rail lines were shattered by bombing, and the further the front advanced, the longer and thinner those supply lines became. In early September 1944, American armored columns were advancing so rapidly that some units outran their fuel trucks. Tanks halted on open roads, not from enemy fire, but from empty tanks. General George S. Patton saw something different. From his perspective, the German army was reeling. He believed this was the moment to press relentlessly. Speed, he argued, was the weapon. The enemy was disorganized. Their defensive lines were improvised. If the Allies drove hard toward the Rhine River before the Germans could regroup, the war in Europe might end before Christmas. Patton's Third Army was already driving east, across France at astonishing pace, liberating towns, capturing thousands of prisoners, and advancing toward the Moselle River. But Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. 12th Army Group, saw a different map. His staff reports were blunt. Fuel stocks were dangerously low. Truck convoys, the famous Red Ball Express, were operating around the clock just to maintain minimal supply flow. Bridges over the Seine were damaged or destroyed. The German border was not open farmland. It was defended by the sea line, a belt of concrete bunkers, dragon's teeth, anti-tank obstacles, and fortified strongpoints. A rapid thrust could turn into a stalled spearhead, and a stalled spearhead could become vulnerable. The debate was not theatrical. It was logistical, operational, and deeply consequential. Should the Allies concentrate resources on a narrow thrust, perhaps under British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery in the north, aiming for a decisive crossing of the Rhine, or maintain a broad front advance, keeping pressure along the entire line to prevent German concentration? His Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower favored the broad front. His reasoning was methodical. By advancing on a wide axis, the Allies would force the Germans to defend everywhere, preventing them from massing for a counterattack. It was cautious, but stable. Patton saw it as hesitation. In early September, as Paris celebrated liberation, Patton's columns approached the Moselle River near Metz. German resistance stiffened. The terrain shifted, rolling hills, rivers, fortified cities. German commanders, including Field Marshal Walter Model, were reorganizing defensive positions behind natural barriers. The war was changing shape. On September 1st, Allied forces officially crossed the Seine along multiple axes. German units retreated toward Belgium and the German frontier. But they were no longer fleeing blindly. They were moving toward prepared ground. Every mile east meant longer fuel routes for the Americans and shorter retreat lines for the Germans. Inside Allied headquarters, the tension sharpened. Patton demanded priority in fuel allocation to continue his offensive toward the Saar region, a vital industrial area of Western Germany. Bradley weighed the request against competing demands. Montgomery was preparing his own ambitious operation in the Netherlands. British and Canadian forces needed resupply after heavy fighting in Normandy. Resources were finite. Trucks could only carry so much. Ports were limited. Weather would soon deteriorate. By mid-September, Patton's advance began to stall near Metz. German forces reinforced the city's extensive 19th-century fortifications, converting them into modern defensive strong points. Artillery duels replaced rapid maneuver. Infantry assaults replaced sweeping armored breakthroughs. The quick collapse Patton envisioned did not materialize, yet neither did a decisive German recovery, not yet in Berlin. Hitler raged at the loss of Paris, but saw opportunity in Allied overextension. He believed the Anglo-American alliance would fracture under strain. He ordered defensive lines strengthened along the West Wall, the Siegfried Line. Units withdrawn from France were refitted and redeployed. Crucially, German command began planning ACOUNTERSTROKE. Not immediately, but soon. The Allied High Command understood that liberation did not equal defeat. German industrial capacity, though bombed, still functioned. Millions of soldiers remained under arms. The Eastern Front consumed enormous German resources, but the Western Front was stabilizing. The war's center of gravity was shifting from liberation to invasion. The next objective was no longer France, it was Germany itself. In Paris, cafes reopened. Newspapers printed freely. French citizens shaved the heads of collaborators. American soldiers posed for photographs beneath the Eiffel Tower. But east of the city, engines roared through mud and dust. Fuel shortages forced hard choices. Divisions paused, not because of enemy fire, but because supply columns could not keep up. Each halted tank represented opportunity lost, and each lost day gave the German army something priceless: time to dig in. By late September 1944, the euphoria had faded at headquarters. The front lines stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border. The Allies had advanced hundreds of miles in weeks, but their momentum was thinning. Patton still believed a breakthrough was possible. Bradley remained cautious. Eisenhower balanced political unity with military necessity. Underneath the triumph of Paris, a strategic crossroads had emerged: push hard and risk collapse, or consolidate and risk giving the enemy a second life. The liberation of Paris was a symbol. What came next would decide the war, and within 3 months, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, that debate would explode into one of the most violent surprises of World War II. But in August 1944, no one in the cheering streets of Paris could yet see that storm gathering. They saw only freedom. The generals saw something else: a race against time. September 1944, the advance stopped, not because the Germans had driven the Allies back, not because a defensive line had shattered American armor. It stopped because the fuel trucks could not keep up. Columns of Sherman tanks stood silent along French roads, engines cold, crews smoking beside vehicles that had outrun their lifeline. Ammunition stocks were thin. artillery batteries rationed, shells, even food distribution lagged behind the front. And then the order came down from Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force: temporary halt, consolidate, reorganize. To some, it was discipline; to others, it was the first crack in momentum. The halt was not announced publicly. There was no dramatic proclamation. It filtered through command channels in early September as a series of practical directives. Units were to pause offensive thrusts until supply lines stabilized. Fuel priority would be redistributed. Port capacity would be expanded. The logic was straightforward. By September 3rd, British forces had entered Brussels. Antwerp was captured on September 4th, a vital deep-water port that could transform Allied logistics. But the approaches to Antwerp remained in German hands. The Scheldt estuary was heavily defended. Until that waterway was cleared, the port was unusable. Meanwhile, the front lines stretched nearly 500 miles. The Red Bull Express, thousands of trucks operating around the clock, hauled fuel and ammunition from Normandy depots. Drivers worked in shifts without headlights at night to avoid Luftwaffe observation. Breakdowns were constant. Roads clogged with traffic. Each mile east multiplied the strain. General Dwight D. Eisenhower faced a strategic reality: advance too far, too fast, and the spearheads would collapse under their own weight. But General George S. Patton saw something else entirely. Patton's Third Army had surged across France with breathtaking speed. From its breakout in late July through August, it liberated over 80 towns and captured tens of thousands of German prisoners. Entire enemy formations dissolved in retreat. Now, Patton was within reach of the Moselle River and the German frontier. In his view, the Wehrmacht was on the verge of systemic collapse. Intelligence suggested fuel shortages inside Germany. Retreating units were disorganized. Defensive lines were improvised. Momentum, Patton believed, was the decisive weapon. He argued that if Third Army received concentrated fuel allocation, it could push through Lorraine, cross the Rhine, and strike directly into the Saar Germany's industrial heartland. But Eisenhower rejected the idea of a single thrust. He favored the broad front strategy. Instead of concentrating resources on one narrow axis, Allied forces would advance along the entire line, north through Belgium and the Netherlands, center across the Ardennes, south through Lorraine. The aim was to keep the Germans off balance. Everywhere it was methodical, but it diluted speed. The halt order exposed a deeper philosophical divide. Patton believed war was about shock, about driving the enemy so hard that his command structure shattered. He feared giving the Germans time to breathe. Bradley Kamei in the U.S. 12th Army Group understood Patton's aggression, but he also saw the fragility beneath it. Fuel stocks in some sectors were down to less than 2 days' supply. Artillery units were conserving ammunition at critical river crossings. Replacement infantry lagged behind advancing armored divisions. A stalled advance could be recovered, an overextended one could be destroyed. As September unfolded, the consequences of the pause became visible. The German forces retreating across the Seine in late August had been scattered. Now they regrouped behind natural barriers: the Meuse, the Moselle, and ultimately the West Wall, known to the Allies as the Siegfried Line. Concrete bunkers emerged from wooded hillsides. Anti-tank ditches were reactivated. Fields were seeded with mines. Engineers repaired fortifications damaged earlier in the war. Field Marshal Walter Model, known for defensive skill, took command of Army Group B. He had one task: stabilize the ACI Western Front. The halt order gave him time, not months, but weeks. Weeks were enough. By mid-September, Patton's forces encountered stiff resistance around Metz. The city's ring of forts, constructed decades earlier by the Germans, formed a natural defensive complex. Artillery embedded in reinforced positions dominated river crossings. Assaulting such positions required planning, infantry coordination, and heavy shelling, all of which consumed fuel and ammunition. Patton pushed anyway, but without sustained supply priority. Each offensive pulse lost strength. Divisions advanced, paused, reorganized, and advanced again. What had been fluid maneuver warfare slowed into grinding attrition. North of him, a different gamble unfolded. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery proposed Operation Market Garden, a bold airborne assault through the Netherlands aimed at seizing bridges over the Rhine. If successful, it would outflank the Siegfried Line and open a direct route into Germany. Eisenhower approved it. To Patton. This confirmed his fear. Resources were being divided, momentum was being negotiated. Operation Market Garden launched on September 17, 1944. Thousands of paratroopers descended near Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem. Initial success was dramatic. Bridges were seized, but German armored units, refitting near Arnhem, counterattacked with speed and force. The British 1st Airborne Division became isolated. Ground forces struggled to advance along a single exposed highway. Within days, the offensive faltered. The Rhine crossing at Arnhem failed. The cost was severe, and while attention focused on the Netherlands, the Central Front remained stalled. Inside Allied headquarters, the debate intensified. Was the halt a necessary recalibration or a squandered opportunity? Intelligence estimates in late September showed that German divisions were reconstituting faster than expected. Replacement troops from training units were rushed west. Equipment losses were partially replenished. Defensive belts thickened. The window for collapse had closed, not because the Germans had regained superiority, but because they had regained coherence. Yet the halt was not without strategic benefit. Supply depots expanded, rail lines were repaired. Antwerp's approaches were finally cleared after bitter fighting in the Scheldt by Canadian forces in October and November. When the port became operational, it dramatically shortened Allied logistics. Had the Allies driven recklessly toward the Rhine without resolving these bottlenecks, they might have faced disaster deeper inside Germany with no secure supply base. Behind them, the decision was not cowardice, it was calculation. But calculation carries risk. By October 1944, autumn rains turned fields into mud. Mechanized movement slowed. German resistance hardened along the entire front. The rapid pursuit phase of the campaign had ended. What replaced it was siege. In Lorraine, Patton launched repeated assaults across flooded rivers under artillery fire. Casualties mounted. Progress was measured in miles. In the Hirchen Forest, near Aachen, American divisions entered dense woodland against fortified German positions. The fighting became brutal, confused, and costly. Visibility dropped 2 meters. Artillery shells burst in treetops, sending lethal fragments downward. The easy victories of August were gone. The war had entered a new phase, and in Germany, Adolf Hitler watched. He interpreted the halt differently than Eisenhower or Patton. To him, it was proof that Allied unity was fragile. He believed the Western Allies feared casualties. He believed boldness could fracture them, so he began planning something audacious. A counteroffensive through the Ardennes, the same forested region the Germans had used in 1942. Surprise, France. He would gamble everything on one last throw. But that plan required time to prepare, time to move divisions, time to stockpile fuel, time to conceal movement from Allied air power. The halt, or the strategic pause, or dangerous delay, gave him precisely that. By late November 1944, snow dusted the Ardennes hills. American units along that sector considered it quiet. Many divisions resting there were inexperienced or recovering from previous combat. They believed the main fight would continue elsewhere. They were wrong. The strategic argument that began beneath the celebrations of Paris had not ended. It had merely shifted into colder terrain. Calculated patience had preserved Allied strength. Relentless aggression had been restrained, and in the silence that followed the halt, the German army prepared its most desperate gamble of the war. The consequences would erupt in December, and when they did, every decision made in September would be tested under fire. September 1944, Eastern France. The fuel gauges were low. Orders from Supreme Headquarters called for consolidation, reorganization, stabilization of the line. The message was clear: pause, strengthen logistics, avoid overextension. But on the roads east of the Seine, engines were still running. General George S. Patton did not believe in stillness. He believed in pressure, and pressure, he believed, was the only language the collapsing German army understood.